Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. This is Lynn Bergeson, Managing Partner at Bergeson and Campbell, and I'm joined today by my esteemed colleague, Dr. Richard Engler, our Director of Chemistry and all-around TSCA guru. I think before we get into the content of our slides, you all know the drill. You are muted, but we do solicit your questions by entering them into the Q&A portal on your Zoom dashboard there. We have already sent a copy of our PowerPoint slides, speaker bios, and some really, really good resources are available in your resources portion of the dashboard. So I urge you to take a look at that. Following the webinar, we gather all of the questions that we have been asked to address, and we repeat the question and provide the answer. So we'll be sending that out along with a copy of the recording after the webinar. So without further ado, why don't we begin to go through our agenda, Rich?
Great. Well, welcome everybody. So we're gonna talk. We'll start off with a background of the rule, what a PFAS is, what's reportable. We'll touch on. Well, we'll talk about where PFAS might be in your supply chain. We can't give you a definitive answer. We could just give you some places to look. What diligence is due? This is a key question that keeps coming up. And then how do you manage the data and the information that you gather while you're while you're doing your data search for what might be reportable? So as a reminder, OPPT has its own definition, or has developed a definition for reporting for this rule. And there are three categories, and they are categorical. There is no definitive list of PFAS. EPA has been clear about that all along. A lot of people have asked for CAS numbers. There is a list of CAS numbers that EPA considers PFAS, but it is not an exhaustive list. So you really need to look at structures. You need to look at what PFAS might be there, and do any PFAS that are present match any of these definitions. The first is two adjacent carbons, one with two fluorines and one with one fluorine. The second is two fully fluorinated carbons, two CF2 groups on either side of an oxygen. And the third is two trifluoromethyl groups attached to a single carbon. So those are the three categorical definitions for PFAS for purposes of this reporting rule. Basically, you need two or more fully fluorinated carbons. It's not the OECD definition of a single fully fluorinated carbon, which many other authorities, including most of the states that are taking PFAS action, do follow OECD. OPPT has taken a different approach for this. So what's required? Reporting is required for all PFAS meeting those definitions, manufactured or imported for commercial purpose in any year from the beginning of 2011 through the end of 2022. EPA did not have any option about that reporting window. A lot of people are complaining about the reporting window. That was written into the statute. So we do have to look back. There are questions. We do get questions quite a bit about what if we can't find records, and that goes to what is known or reasonably ascertainable, and we'll talk about that later. Articles, very importantly, articles containing PFAS, if imported, are potentially reportable. You do need to think about if there's PFAS in an article that was imported. And this is probably the most challenging aspect. I mean, as you may remember, if you've listened to any of our previous webinars or our podcast or read anything we've written about this, EPA really does not offer any exemptions to the PFAS reporting. There's no de minimis, there's no article exemption, there's no small business exemption, there's no impurity exemption. If there's a PFAS present in something that was manufactured, or if the PFAS was manufactured, or if there was a PFAS present in something that was imported, it's potentially reportable. So you do need to be thinking about everything that was imported, whether you distribute it, whether it's something that you distribute or something that you imported for your own use, that's still a commercial purpose. Is there a PFAS present in what was imported? And this is definitely a significant challenge. It includes things like electronics. Many electronics have PFAS embedded in them. We'll talk more about HDPE, fluorinated HDPE containers. If you're at all aware of the Enhance case, you're aware that fluorinated HDPE containers are coated with a PFAS, so those would be reportable under this rule. What's not reportable is things that are excluded from TSCA authority. So if you have a product that is a medical device or a drug or a pesticide product, those would be, to the extent that the package is under the authority of that other statute, then the package is part of that drug product or medical device product or pesticide product, and that would be excluded from TSCA authority. But at some point, the packaging is generic enough that it's not under that authority, and then that would be under EPA authority. So a drug package, if the instructions are printed on the package, it's very likely that FDA asserts authority over that drug package, and that drug package would therefore be under FFDCA. It would be a component of the drug, and it would be excluded from EPA authority. But if you have that package and it's just a bunch of those in a generic cardboard box, that cardboard box is probably not under FDA authority, and that cardboard box is probably therefore under TSCA authority. So there is some line there between the FDA or pesticides and TSCA, and you have to look carefully at your packaging at what point does the authority become, or does the packaging become generic enough to not be under the other statutory authority. Importers of articles containing PFAS, I said it on the previous slide, we'll say it again later, articles are potentially reportable. Is there a PFAS in the article? Is it known to be present? Is it intentionally present? Is it known to be present as an impurity? Those are reportable. This is, this is a headache. Now, EPA does offer for article reporting, they do offer some simplified reporting. So there is some relief if you're an article importer, and we'll talk about how that looks. That streamlined reporting. Again, no exemptions, no impurity exemption, no byproduct exemption, no de minimis exemption, no small business exemption. The only exemption is municipal solid waste imported to be disposed of as waste. If that's your commercial activity, and then EPA basically acknowledges that you have no idea if there's a PFAS in there, what it might be or how much. So EPA says, if you're importing municipal solid waste for disposal, you are not obligated to report. Otherwise, you are obligated to at least consider whether there's a PFAS present. You may or may not report it because you may or may not be able to identify a PFAS being present, but you do have to look at everything that was imported in that 12-year look-back period. Information that you submit may be claimed as CBI. The CBI provisions are available. Claims must be made at the time of submission, and they must be substantiated if substantiation is required. Some of the information that you might report, like production volumes, would be exempt from substantiation, but much of the information that you would consider reporting may not be exempt, and so you will have to provide substantiation. If any information that is known or reasonably ascertainable to you must be reported. If you report that the information is not known or reasonably ascertainable, you may not claim the NKRA response as CBI. Other things that are not reportable: processing. So if you are in the United States and you're processing a chemical, you're blending, you're making an article from a PFAS substance, you're processing an article that contains a PFAS, you're reworking it, you're taking a PFAS textile and you're making a PFAS safety coat. That would be processing a PFAS, or distributing an article containing PFAS. These are not manufacturing or importing. These are all processing or distributing activities. And so if you are not the importer of record, you are not the manufacturer of the PFAS substance, these things are not reportable under this rule. Only manufacturing or import is reportable under this rule. So we're going to take a quick quiz now after I've said that. So a company located in Georgia obtains a PFAS from a U.S. supplier and blends it with other components without a reaction into a formulated product that it distributes to customers. So you have a PFAS component, you have non-PFAS component, you mix them together and you distribute that product. Who is the reportable? So we're going to put up a quiz here. Who is responsible for reporting for this PFAS? Is it company X? Is it the company that's doing this PFAS blending? Is it company X a supplier, that PFAS supplier? Is it somebody else? Or is it no one? No one's responsible for reporting. So we'll just take a second here. You see the poll, the quiz popped up. So please
We've got
answer.
a lot of answers coming in, over
Great,
150 already.
great.
I'll leave it up for a few more seconds.
All right,
So I will
how to
be
come out?
ending the poll now and showing the results.
So 70% said the supplier, 11% said someone else, 8% said no one, and 17% said company X. Well, company X, because company X neither manufactured nor imported the PFAS, company X is not the reporter for this PFAS. The company X did not manufacture or import, so company X is not the supplier. It's not clear because we don't know where the supplier got the PFAS. Did the supplier make it, or did the supplier import it, or did the supplier get it from someone else and do something else in the United States? So it could be the supplier, or it could be somebody else. Again, it is the manufacturer or the importer of the PFAS that's responsible. So if the supplier was the importer or the manufacturer, then you are correct. It would be the supplier. If the supplier sourced it in the United States from someone else, as company X did, then the supplier is not the reporter either. It's that original manufacturer or importer. Somebody is a reporter for this PFAS. That PFAS is in the United States. Somebody manufactured or imported. That company would be the reporter for this PFAS. So it's either the supplier or someone else is the answer here. All right, let's try another one. Here's a different company located in Indiana, and they import equipment manufactured in Canada with PTFE, that is polytetrafluoroethylene O-rings. So the equipment has these PTFE O-rings as seals in the equipment, and that equipment, the company imports that equipment from Canada. In this scenario, who reports under TSCA Section 8A7? Again, here's the quiz. Is it company Y? Is it the Canadian supplier, someone else, or no one?
We've got a lot of results coming in, and people seem to have a clear favorite for this one. I'm going to let it go for a few more seconds. And I'm ending the poll now, and we'll share the results.
Great. Correct answer. 95% said company Y. Company Y was the importer. Company Y is the reporter. Company Y imported the article, the O-ring, or the article, the equipment with the O-ring in it, because company Y was the importer of that PTFE. Company Y is the one that has that reporting obligation. The supplier, who's outside the United States, does not have reporting obligations under TSCA because TSCA does not reach past the border. So EPA cannot impose those sorts of requirements on non-US companies. All right, let's go on. What are our compliance? What do the timelines look like? I assume many of our listeners are also working on their chemical data reporting, CDR, quadrennial chemical data reporting, although the requirements are very different for 8A7 and CDR. CDR has many of the exemptions that 8A7 does not. A lot of folks are focusing on CDR right now, including EPA, including us, and many of our clients. The reporting period for PFAS does not start until the fall, and it's not due until May 8th. If you are also a small manufacturer who is only reporting imported articles, you have an additional 6 months to November 2025. The rule requires that if you are a reporter, that you keep records of the information that you report. So whatever you end up reporting to EPA, you are required to keep records that support what you report to EPA for 5 years, beginning on the last day of the submission period. So that May 8th, 2025 deadline, 5 years. So you would have to keep records until May of 2030. That's how long you must keep the records that support what you report to EPA. If you do not report to EPA information, like you decide that the boxes, the packaging that you imported, that's those standard cardboard boxes, do not contain the PFAS, you are not required to keep the records of what you do not report. So the due diligence that you do to determine that you didn't report those, you are not required to keep those records. But we suggest and EPA suggests that you do. It's just not required by the rule. If you are, I mentioned this before, if you are importing articles, and there are a lot of article importers here, right? Again, this is because the lack of the article exemption, there is a much wider range of potential reporters for 8A7 rule. Companies that do not normally think of themselves as being subject to TSCA because they're not dealing in chemicals, they're dealing in articles. Articles, of course, are made up of chemicals, but the article exemption, most of the provisions of TSCA are eligible for an article exemption. So most importers of articles sort of don't think of themselves as being under TSCA. They are, and this rule definitely applies to articles. So if you imported articles containing a PFAS, you can use the streamlined article reporting form. And it doesn't require the extensive information that's required for substances that are imported, things like the process codes, use codes, industry codes, number of workers exposed, and other information. The article importing tool is really limited to how much is imported, and you can report how much in one of three different ways. You can report on the amount of PFAS if you know the amount of PFAS that was contained in an article. You can report the number of articles that contained the PFAS, so just the count of articles. So that might be useful if you're importing, say, computers or cars. Or you can report the mass of the articles that were imported. And you may or may not be aware, I think that in my life where I've done this is I've bought nails by the pound. I bought a box of 2 pounds of nails. I have no idea how many nails are in there. The supplier doesn't know how many nails are in there. Just it's 2 pounds of nails. So if you have imported articles by the pound, you can report the total mass of articles, PFAS-containing articles that were imported. You don't necessarily need to know the amount of PFAS in that quantity. You just report the mass.
All right, I am up.
Yep.
There's been an awful lot of inquiry, at least in our shop, regarding what the legal standard is with regard to discharging your due diligence requirements under this TSCA 8A7 reporting rule. And before I go through the example here, I just want to refresh everyone's recollection of what that standard is. To me, the preamble to the final rule, which was published on October the 11th of 2023, really provides a good deal of information that reporters should familiarize themselves with as they go through this odyssey of reporting PFAS. Under the rule, known to or reasonably ascertainable by is defined to include, and this is again excerpted from the preamble discussion, all information in a person's possession or control, plus all information that a reasonable person, this elusive reasonable person, similarly situated might be expected to possess, control, or know. Then EPA goes on to state that this reporting standard requires reporting entities to evaluate their current level of knowledge of their manufactured products, including imports, as well as evaluate whether there is additional information that a reasonable person similarly situated would be expected to know, possess, or control. And then importantly, and finally, this standard carries with it an exercise of due diligence and the information gathering activities that may be necessary for manufacturers to achieve this reporting standard may vary from case to case, which is a long-winded way of saying you should be doing your due diligence in a way that comports with the four corners of the legal standard, and do so in a way that is reasonable within the confines of your infrastructure. Not everybody's reporting standard is going to be the same. And the agency explicitly recognizes that because smaller companies may be less amenable to exhaustive analyses of records and imports and may have limited opportunities to engage in as thorough or as extensive an exercise of due diligence as entities that have more resources and have more established practices and protocols for achieving that standard. So it will vary. It's not a one size fits all, but it needs to be consistent. And in our view, what we are urging our clients to do is record your protocols in a way that can be truth tested, applied, and deployed consistently throughout your company's operations, and ensure that everyone is on the same page regarding what steps you are going to be engaged in to discharge your due diligence obligations. So we give one example here. Company X, or C here, imports an article with a water repellent fluoropolymer surface, but that importing entity, Company C, does not know the chemical identity or molecular structure of the fluoropolymer coating. So what are you required to do when you don't know, but because of the properties of the imported article, you have reason to believe that there's a PFAS present? So next slide.
Sorry.
So applying this known to or reasonably ascertainable reporting standard, in our view, some of the more intuitive steps would be to contact the supplier to determine the name, the chemical abstract registry number, the molecular structure of the fluoropolymer, or whatever information that, would reasonably enable the reporter to discharge their due diligence obligation. And you would hope that the supplier provides this information to the entity asking for it so it can report the information as appropriate. That is, in the normal course of business, a reasonable response to knowing that there is a PFAS in this fluoropolymer coating, but you don't know what the CAS number is, if any. You certainly don't know the chemical identity. You know what you know, and you don't know what you don't know. So you ask your supplier. That would be a reasonable discharge of the standard for due diligence under the 8A7, known to or reasonably ascertainable. Now, if the company that Company C is asking neglects, or if Company C neglects to ask the supplier at all, it simply takes the position, look, I don't know what the fluoropolymer is. We don't have access to that information. It's not in our records. We've looked in our records and it's not there. Our view is that by not contacting this supplier, you have not adequately or lawfully discharged your due diligence obligations, that at a minimum, you need to reach out to your supplier. Reasonable people may disagree, but I think if it's known to or reasonably ascertainable, making a call, sending an email, trying to get in touch with the supplier, and exploring the identity of the fluoropolymer in more detail is a reasonable, expected, and, in my view, necessary step to discharge your due diligence operations. So next slide. So another question that we get often is, well, how do we report uncertainty? How do we report consistently and express uncertainty in a way that aligns with the legal standard under the rule? We have been urging our clients and others who ask to develop robust, they don't have to be extensive, but develop a protocol and a policy that enables you to manage uncertainty in a way that aligns with the reporting standard under the rule. In our view, a written policy that can be shared with various divisions throughout your company is both an expedient. It ensures consistency, and consistency is needed here because the agency, if there should be a review of what kind of information is reported, will notice disparate levels of due diligence in the same company. So to the extent that you can develop a written policy that is shared and agreed upon by everyone who is in this reporting chain is a good thing. And try to record the decision-making process that elicited a result that either yielded the information that was reported or yielded a not known or reasonably ascertainable, and why that is. Again, records can serve your interest well. Written policies that are applied consistently can serve your interest well. And recognize too, as Rich and I will talk about when we get into the Q&A, EPA compliance is one endpoint here, but it is certainly not the only one. To the extent these records could be subpoenaed or requested in discovery and forthcoming lawsuits from third-party neighbors and other entities beyond the government, you want to have a defensible, consistent, and thoughtful response to why you did what you did. And the best way to facilitate achieving that goal is to have written policies and a summary of the decision-making process that it went into why you claim something was not known or reasonably ascertainable, or why you put the information that you did in your reporting form. If PFAS is likely, but obviously not known or not reasonably ascertainable, that's when the NKRA response is both necessary, but also you want to have it supported by a sequence of events and a recorded summary that enables you to confidently give that response and explain why. If there's no PFAS likely in a particular import or product, you're obviously not required to report. You're only required to report not known or reasonably ascertainable when there's a reasonable belief that PFAS is there, but you have no further information and you've exhausted all reasonable means to procure that information. And finally, you need to decide how to report if PFAS is, certainly theoretically possible based on claims made with regard to the material, your knowledge of the product, your knowledge of the functionalities of products associated or characteristics associated with the product, but not certain and you can't confirm. That ambiguity, that lack of certainty is, in our view, Rich and I and others on the PFAS team here at BNC are trying to provide a framework for managing uncertainty and to do so in a way that aligns with the legally required reporting standard, and also what is rational, appropriate, and scaled and calibrated to the size of your operation and the resources that you're able to devote to this. So next slide. Gathering information. We have made this recommendation now for quite a while since the final rule came out, recognizing that since October and even before October, we are all mindful of the burgeoning number of state reporting obligations, international reporting obligations under other, countries in the EU, for example, and South America and Latin America, and the federal reporting standard under TSCA. So we are urging our clients to develop suitable mechanisms that capture information that align with reporting obligations of all of these disparate federal, state, and international PFAS reporting obligations. So in our view, it makes a whole lot more sense to define PFAS as broadly as all of the regulatory mandates require, and then selectively to report information as appropriate, depending upon what the reporting obligation is. That way you don't have to keep going back and reviewing your supply chain with a view toward a different regulatory endpoint in mind. The information that you collect now for 8A7 could be equally important for emerging and emerging and existing reporting obligations. As I think many of you know, if you have operations in a multitude of states, there are a growing number of state reporting obligations that are specific to certain types of PFAS that are 9 times out of 10 more broadly defined than the federal EPA reporting standard. It's more aligned with the OECD definition, so it's more inclusive. But if you are in the process of discharging your 8A7 obligations, collecting that information for a broader suite of PFAS that align with these broader definitions under the states that have reporting obligations will serve your interests well. So once that information is in hand, you certainly discharge your obligations timely to EPA under 8A7 and then hold back information that might be similarly reported now or has already been reported under the Minnesota reporting obligation, or California or Maine, or whatever the reporting obligation may be. So we are certainly urging people to be mindful of the totality of existing and emerging PFAS reporting obligations, and also to maintain information independent of reporting standards. As noted, we are sadly mindful of the growing number of private tort and other reporting obligations that are being elicited in litigations, whether they are from the federal government under Superfund obligations, RCRA obligations, or whatever. There are just going to be a lot of different demands for these data, and trying to organize them in a way that is most aligned with your ability to produce them efficiently is our preferred way of gathering this information. Next slide, Rich. We are of the view that gathering this information should be done so under the direction of in-house or outside counsel, so you can comfortably assert the attorney-client privilege. We all recognize that these data will be requested in a number of different contexts. Certainly, EPA might come knocking after the reporting obligation is satisfied as far as the next year deadline is concerned. But again, these data are potentially damaging, and you want to be in a position to assert whatever privilege you can to deny the response in discovery or subpoenas, but whoever the asker is, by asserting the attorney-client prepared in anticipation of litigation, self-audit privilege, whatever privilege you can comfortably and adequately support, we urge you to do so. And that means segregating these files in a way that makes them special and not part of your normal business retention, record retention policy. So again, it's a little more cumbersome, and you need to be mindful of what your federal and state privilege obligations are, and they do vary, but to the extent that you can engage in that scholarship and comfortably assert as many privileges as you can, we think it's a good idea to do so, because these data are going to be sought after by detractors of the company, and managing them and curating them appropriately is just a really good idea. So, Rich, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, so touched on earlier, CBI claims are available, so the standard CBI rules apply to this rule. The reporting tool, we expect that the reporting tool, like the CDR tool, will prompt for substantiation for claims that are made. If those fields are required substantiation, the standard substantiation exemptions are available. So production volume, specific process information, supplier customer relationship information. Thus, those standard exemptions are available to information reported under this rule. So if you make those claims, if you're claiming the quantity imported or the quantity manufactured as CBI, you will not have to substantiate that CBI claim. But if you're claiming something else as CBI, say the submitter information or other specific information that's in that's in your report, the system will prompt you for the substantiation. If you are reporting with an accession number, I want to emphasize this. If you are reporting with an accession number, you have to check the CBI claim box to continue to protect the CBI of that chemical identity. EPA has taken this position in the past, and again in the rule, they made it explicit in the rule. If somebody reports an accession number and does not check the CBI, the CBI claim box, EPA interprets that as an affirmative disclosure of the underlying identity, whether or not the reporter actually knows the underlying identity, which we still don't quite understand the logic of that, but that's EPA's position. They've made it very clear. Accession numbers reported without a continued CBI claim will be disclosed, regardless of whether or not the submitter actually knows the underlying identity. I mentioned it before, NKR response cannot be claimed as CBI. There's certain other information that's fairly generic that cannot be claimed as CBI, but many of the fields that you might report will be amenable to CBI claims. Okay, so we took some of the pre-submitted questions and we've tossed them in here because we got a number of questions related to this, and these are very common questions that we've heard from clients, um, both current clients and prospective clients and people that I meet out when we're out about at conferences and other places. So is packaging in scope? I said it before. Yes, imported packaging is within scope. If you're sourcing that packaging in the United States and you are not the importer, that you are not the reporter for that, but the importer of packaging, whether it's a collapsed box that's going to be turned into a box that's going to be used, or it's a box with product in it, that packaging, those are articles, and that articles are in scope. My view as a chemist is that standard cardboard packaging probably does not contain PFAS. There's really no reason to expect PFAS to be in there. So I would think that a standard cardboard box is not reportable. But if you have chemically resistant packaging, I would look at product specifications, or I would inquire of the product manufacturer or the supplier that because presumably you're importing this packaging, this article. Did your foreign supplier make sure to include a PFAS coded package to protect the contents, or protect the package from the contents? If a related question is if a PFAS was imported in a package, an article. So let's say it's PTFE granules, and those granules were imported in a box. What's reportable there? Is the PFAS on the package reportable? For the initial import, I would say just report the quantity of PFAS that was contained in the container, because whether it's still as the granule or if it's rubbed off onto the container, it's still the same amount of PFAS that was imported. So I would report for the quantity of PFAS that was placed into the container, and at least for that report, not worry about whether it rubbed off onto the packaging. You imported the PFAS for a reason, report it for the purpose of that, the import of that substance. If that package is then reused for another substance and re-imported, right? So once you've got that box, and say there's some PTFE rubbed off on the inside of that box, if that's being reused within the United States, there's no additional reporting activity there, because that's not re-import. If that used package leaves the United States and gets imported again, then you should think about whether it's reasonably ascertainable about how much of that PFAS remains on the package. So it's only if that package is exported and re-imported would you have to consider whether the original PFAS remains on the surface, and is that known or reasonably ascertainable? How much is known or reasonably ascertainable? You might simply report that use one of the simplified article reporting options and say, well, this contained PTFE before it was exported, it was imported again. It contained PTFE upon re-import, don't know how much, and so you report the number of those re-imported containers. So that's one way to get at that uncertainty. We had a question about, does this apply to industrial, commercial, or consumer articles and equipment? And yes, across the board. And any article that's imported for any TSCA use is potentially reportable. Only if the article is imported for non-TSCA use. So you imported a medical device, that would be excluded from TSCA authority and therefore exempt from reporting under the rule. We've had questions about re-import. So if you manufacture a PFAS, you export that PFAS to outside the United States, and then for whatever reason, product is out of spec, customer refused it, for any reason, if that product is re-imported, it does become reportable. So it is double reporting, double counting essentially. But EPA has been clear over the years, both for CDR and for this rule, you report the manufacturer in the U.S. and you also report the re-import. That's not a novel construction. EPA has been using this interpretation for quite some time. How thoroughly must a company search its records? Lynn, do you want to take this one?
Sure, because that's a commonly asked question. Well, we might have company records. They might be in some electronic format. They might go back for 15 years, although most people have record retention policies that disallow record retention beyond 5 to 7 years, for example. What if those records are not easily searchable? Do you have to print everything out? And, given the excerpt I read from the October 11 final rule, I think EPA expects that you're not going to have a one-size-fits-all, and it's going to depend upon the size of the company, the complexity of the record retention policy, the number of records that are there to be searched, and what's the capacity of the entity to undertake that exercise. It needs to be scaled, calibrated, and reasonable. If you have records that go back and you have electronic records, for example, in my view, it would be a good idea to try to see what you can ascertain with regard to its searchability. And if there isn't any good functionality, that you have those records, but they're not easily searchable, might well satisfy the obligation to engage in due diligence and reasonably ascertain whether those records contain evidence of reporting obligations. It's going to vary, and there's no one size fits all, but you need to calibrate your responses and calibrate your internal operations in a way that aligns with the four corners of the reporting standard, what is reasonably known or ascertainable, and that's going to vary a lot. Another frequently asked question is, what if a supplier is just being a jerk and doesn't want to share the identity of a PFAS? Well, if a supplier comes back and says, well, we know, but we're not going to tell you, you might try to ask for different information, the accession number or a low volume exemption, LVE number, some identifier that will assist you in discharging your reporting obligations. You might also ask, is there a generic name or a common name or even a trade name that, again, provides some modest information that enables you to discharge your reporting obligation? And the truth of the matter is a lot of suppliers may not give you the time of day, let alone the responses to these questions. So if you know you are importing a PFAS, but the supplier is entirely uncooperative, I think our recommendation is to go ahead and prepare a joint submission, let the supplier know that you've done so, and that you're waiting for their contributions in that joint submission. And if the supplier supplies the information, great. But if the supplier says go pound sand and doesn't provide the information, in our view, you have done what you can reasonably be expected to do under these circumstances and discharged your obligation. And I would imagine in the real world, there are a lot of different emails and telephone calls and requests for information going out that are just not being responded to at all, let alone with, we know there's PFAS here, but we're not going to tell you. But make the inquiry, discharge your legal duty, keep records of your attempt to procure this information, and at some reasonable, I don't think, Rich, you may disagree, but I don't think you have to go back to the supplier and say, please, please, please provide the information. I think once you've tried and you got bupkas, I think you're done.
Yep. You don't have to chase them up. Right. And they don't have to chase up their suppliers. So
right.
You don't have to ask your supplier to ask the supplier those levels are not required. You have to do your due diligence to figure out what's present. And that might be a question to the supplier. It might be a view of their product literature or their website. But if they refuse to tell you, you've done your due diligence by asking. If it's an imported substance, the joint submission is the way to make it clear to EPA that you are commencing this joint submission process. You do your part. You hope that your supplier does their part, but you don't have authority over your supplier. And if your supplier is outside the United States, neither does EPA. We've got some time left. What about waste? So I mentioned that municipal solid waste imported for disposal is not reportable. Other waste imported into the United States is reportable. Whether PFAS is a waste or not does not change its reportability. Any PFAS that's manufactured in the U.S. and sent for waste disposal, whether it's like a byproduct that's sent for incineration, that PFAS was manufactured in the United States, and even though it's being sent for disposal, it is reportable under this rule. Similarly, any waste that's imported, except for that municipal solid waste, is potentially reportable. If you sourced PFAS in the United States from from someone else who manufactured or imported it, and used it and sent it for disposal, that would not be reportable. Again, this applies to manufacture or import only. Processing and disposal in the United States is not reportable. Manufacture or import is.
So unsurprisingly, Rich, we have a ton of questions, and we're going to, try our best to go through the questions that we received in advance of today. And unsurprisingly, there have been many more coming in since we started. So let's begin. Given the challenges downstream companies face knowing what chemicals are in products they use, do we have any thoughts about the percentage of responses that will be known or be not known, NKRA, or reasonably ascertainable?
Oh, in terms of the percentage of the response,
Yeah.
like the PFAS reporting rule, my guess is if I would set the over under as like 80% of the reporting is going to be NKRA. I think there's going to be a very small percentage of like really useful information. I think we're going to get vast amounts of NKR information. I think that for a lot of the information, especially for articles, the importer is going to know that PFAS is present, but they're not going to know what it is, how much is there, and they'll just report NKRA. Or they may report, they'll report the import of an article, but they'll report NKRA, a PFAS containing article, but they won't know what the PFAS is, and so it'll be an NKRA PFAS.
Yeah. I would tend to agree, Rich. There's certainly going to be a high percentage of NKRA for imports of articles. For domestic producers of PFAS substances, there will be far more granularity provided.
Yeah, I agree, but I think that's going to be a relatively small percentage of all the reports that'll be received.
Right. Do we have any thoughts about the capacity of OCSPP staff and computer systems, given what we've all endured with CrowdStrike this week, to handle the amount of data that's supposed to come through this and through the PFAS reporting, and also the CDR that could start trickling in from the 8A7? I guess the early birds might be getting information in well in advance of the 2025 deadline. And do we have a sense of EPA's ability to manage both reporting obligations given the fragility of the CDX system?
Well, EPA has already warned that the tool may not be available when the reporting period opens, so that may get delayed. Whether EPA also delays the reporting deadline may depend on how much the tool is delayed at the beginning. But I think the CDX reporting system, if you are trying to report close to the end, the system may get overwhelmed by late reporters. We've seen that in years past for CDR. Yeah. In the last couple of days of CDR reporting, the system gets really bogged down because so many people are trying to report near the deadline. But if you're reporting earlier, if you're not waiting to the last minute, you're probably going to be okay in terms of reporting the information. In terms of reviewing and analyzing the information, that is going to be a much more significant challenge to OCSPP. They do look at CDR. They look at trends in CDR. How have reports from particular companies changed from, say, 2020 to 2024, 2016, 2020, 2024. That's mostly a data quality exercise. EPA is not going to have that in this situation because this is one-time reporting. So I'm sure EPA will do some sort of data quality check, but I don't think they're going to start doing real deep analysis of the information that they receive in the immediate future. It's going to be an enormous amount of data, and EPA's plate is already very full.
I know we've already touched upon some of the questions that we have been sent in, but there are portions of questions that we didn't. So one relates in a broader topic that we've probably fielded a fair number of questions on, Rich, relate to joint reporting. I don't think that is intuitively what comes to mind when 8A7 comes in, but one person asks if you can provide some common scenarios where joint reporting really makes it's a good business decision to pursue.
Yeah, I think that the joint reporting is going to be most useful. There's really two instances. One is you're importing a formulation. Your supplier, you know that there's a PFAS present either because your supplier told you or because of the nature of the product that you're importing. But you don't know what it is and you don't know the quantity. And then that would be a case where you would initiate joint reporting. You would report what you know about the import, the processing and use in the United States, all those fields that are common from CDR that it relates to, what's happening in the United States. That as the importer, you have more knowledge than your foreign supplier would, and then in the joint submission, when you ask the secondary submitter, your supplier, you ask them to provide the quantity information and the chemical identity information. So I think that's going to be a common issue. That's something that's not that unusual even for CDR. The other scenario that I think is less common, but is a potential, is where you are importing, or you are converting a PFAS substance to another substance, and your supplier doesn't tell you the specific identity of the substance that you're converting. So you're taking A and converting it to B, and B's identity is derivative of A, and you don't know what A is. And so a joint report there is you would report to EPA, I made B from A, and my joint submitter is going to tell you what A is, so that EPA can figure out what B is. You tell EPA how much B you made, what you used it for, but you don't know the specific identity of B because you don't know the specific identity of A. And that's where a joint reporter would provide that information directly to EPA.
Great. Thanks, Rich.
Mm-hmm.
I think I know the answer to this one. Has EPA clearly defined the details of the data submission requirements? And the answer is yes.
Yeah, the rule lays out the data submission requirements. They're very similar to, I mean, there are some deviations from CDR, but if you're familiar with chemical data reporting, you'll be familiar with a lot of the fields. If you're doing article reporting only, those fields are generally not going to be required. So, but if you're importing or manufacturing substances, you'll tell EPA what you know about workers exposed, uses, what's happening downstream. And just as with CDR, what's happening downstream may be NKRA to you. So NKRA it can be an answer in many of the reporting fields if it's truly not known or reasonably ascertainable. I would, if you're looking for an idea of what that data structure looks like, I would download the CDR template that's available now in the CDR data flow. You can see what those fields look like. That can give you a flavor of what would be required for PFAS. If you are in one of the, there is probably a relatively small group that's not a CDR reporter, not an article importer, but you are either a small business or an R&D house and you are exempt from CDR requirements, and you're looking for what is that data going to look like. So if you've never seen CDR before and you're importing substances, that's where I would go. I would look at that CDR data template to see what to expect. But again, that data template will come out with the reporting when the reporting tool becomes available in the fall.
Okay. This person asks, does the 8A7 rule include PFAS data for PFAS-containing products the distributor did not import / manufacture or process and stored only at non-owned, non-operated locations?
If you're not the manufacturer or importer, you're not responsible for reporting. So if you obtained a PFAS substance or article inside the United States, then there's no chemical reaction occurs in what you do when it's in your possession, then you're not a reporter.
Great. And following up on that company C example, some people during the call have asked, what if company C asks and the supplier doesn't provide the information? In the example, what about if the supplier does not provide the information, i.e., doesn't respond or doesn't know? Are duties fulfilled in that case?
Yeah, I think if you've asked, your duty to ask has been fulfilled. Then the question is, what do you report? If is there a like if you are confident there's a PFAS present and you don't know what it is, then I would report, yes, that I imported a PFAS, but I don't know what it is, and I don't know, it's NKRA identity, NKRA quantity, maybe it's NKRA quantity as well. So you would look at the specifics to what can you answer any of those fields, even if you don't know the identity. If you are not sure, and this is where I think a company policy comes in, if you're sort of in that gray area where, yeah, there might have been a PFAS in there, but we really don't know, and we asked and the supplier wouldn't tell us, that's what you need to decide as a company. Where are you going to draw a line for, we're going to report an NKRA PFAS and an NKRA amount, or we're not going to report a PFAS? That's going to depend on the circumstances of the company and the business that you're in, and what you know about your supply chain.
And following on that sequence of questions, what does one do if the supplier is no longer in business? You and I might have different responses to this question.
I think that the answer is, is there any, do you have any reason to think that that yes, it's a PFAS? Let me go back to the PTFE O-ring. So if you imported PTFE O-rings from a supplier that's now defunct, you don't need to ask. It's a PTFE O-ring. You don't need to go back and ask them anything. So the fact that they're defunct doesn't change your reporting obligations. But if you imported equipment, so part of it is, what do you know about what you imported? And if you're pretty sure it was a product specification or you needed a PFAS for a particular reason, then I would do your best to report with what you know. You don't have that supplier to inquire in. So what do you know about that product? But if it's you don't know, you don't have any records about it, the supplier's gone, and then at some point it's just not known or reasonably ascertainable.
Would you have a different response, Rich, if the supplier is out of business, but you know that it was acquired by another entity?
Oh, I wouldn't call that out of business. I would say that business, that previous supplier, I would ask the acquiring
the successor
company.
and interest, right?
Yeah, and that's something we didn't have a chance to talk about. The changes in business, EPA's guidance on mergers and acquisitions and divestitures is the same for PFAS as it is for CDR. You follow the business that imported or manufactured the substance. So if the part of the business that manufactured or imported a PFAS was spun off, then the spin-off is the one that's got the obligation. If you acquired a business that manufactured or imported, you acquired that reporting obligation. And EPA's got a number of examples of that in its FAQs and guidance.
All right. Yeah, another question is, how would we best address the uncertainty involved in a statement like this, which I suspect is not uncommon? This product is not made with PFOA or PFOA, well, probably PFOA or PFAS, is not intentionally present in the product. However, it is possible that PFOA may be present as an impurity or at background/environmental levels.
Well,
NKRA.
Yeah, well, it's certainly the PFOA is NKRA, but that's often a disclaimer that's used when in something else that contains a PFAS, and what that, one interpretation of that is, was PTFE used, but the PTFE was not made using PFOA or PFOS. So I think that statement is of limited utility.
All right.
It tells you about PFOA and PFOS, but it doesn't tell you about other PFAS.
All right. Quick follow-up question, Rich. Can you define what an accession number is, since we talked about it?
Sure. An accession number is a numeric identifier that EPA assigns to substances that are listed on the confidential portion of the inventory. So substances that are listed on the public portion of the inventory are listed with a chemical abstract service registry number, a CAS number, and substances that are listed on the confidential portion are assigned a specific numeric identifier that is unique to that substance. And they are, if you can download a copy of the TSCA inventory, and there's two Excel files. One is the public portion, one is the confidential portion. You can see on the confidential portion there's an accession number and a generic name. And that accession number is the numeric equivalent to a CAS-RN for CBI substances.
And final comment that some person offered is that one of the issues people face is not getting information unless it is subject to an NDA. I think being asked to participate in a non-disclosure agreement is not unreasonable under these circumstances. And so if a supplier vows to share the information that you seek, but only pursuant to a non-disclosure agreement, to me, that falls within the reasonably ascertainable bucket. And I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, it is 12 o'clock. We have many more questions than we have time to answer. But as we often do, we try to aggregate the questions in a way that will enable us to respond, and we'll send them out in writing along with the program materials in a day or so. Rich and I and everyone here at Bergeson and Campbell and the Actor Group would like to thank you for participating in our webinar today. Great questions. You made the webinar all the better for them. And if you have any questions following this webinar, shoot us a question and we'll do our level best to answer it. Thanks so much.